In this video, I'll be speaking about what Virgil meant to Dante, especially in the context of his appearance as a character at the beginning of the Inferno, when he is portrayed as Dante's savior and guide. Virgil will go on to accompany Dante down through the pit of hell and up most of the mountain of purgatory. It's hard to overestimate the importance of Virgil for Dante. While the character of Virgil may be associated allegorically with the faculty of human reason, which returns to the pilgrim after his fearful encounter with the three beasts, Virgil's Aeneid was a fundamental point of reference for Dante the poet, as was Virgil himself for Dante's idea of what it meant to be a poet. In lines 67 and following of Inferno 1, Virgil introduces himself and locates himself in time and space. He is from Mantua, and he was born during pre-Christian times, in the era of Julius Caesar and Augustus. His primary identifier, though, is as a poet. Line 73 opens in Italian, Poeta fui, I was a poet. And not just any poet, but the poet who sang of the foundations of Rome. Dante uses the term poet only sparingly in the comedy. It's a charged word that he reserves for himself and for a few limited poets of classical antiquity. Dante's response to Virgil focuses on this figure of the poet. He is, Dante says, the glory and light of all other poets. And Dante links himself to that light by claiming to have dedicated long hours of study and devotion to his poem and to have modeled his own poetic language on that of Virgil. Virgil here is more than just an allegory. If the character were merely an allegory for reason, then Dante would have chosen another, more appropriate guide, maybe Aristotle or another philosopher of that same tradition. Instead, Dante chose Virgil as his guide, since he stood for everything that it meant to be a poet, a profession that involved assuming an intellectual authority over the nature of human behavior and the course of human history. You are my teacher and my author, the pilgrim declares at line 85. And he goes on a few lines later to call him the famous sage. As a poet, Virgil is a courteous and all-discerning man, to quote from the first tercet of Inferno 7. For Dante, Virgil is representative of the apex of secular wisdom, which made sense of the world without the light of Christ. But he's also seen to have foreshadowed the advent of Christianity in his poetry. Even if Virgil is denied entrance to heaven because he was not privy to revelation, he occupies a privileged space in the medieval Christian imaginary that places him in between the Christian and pagan worlds. The figure of Virgil that Dante represents at the beginning of the Inferno, in fact, is not just Dante's invention, even if it is an intimate account of the importance of the author for him personally. Throughout the Middle Ages, Virgil was imagined as a kind of seer, or even at times a magician or prophet. His fourth eclogue speaks of the birth of a boy who would become a savior and rule over the world. This poem was seen in the Middle Ages and even later to be a prediction of the birth of Christ. It gave Virgil a special kind of authority in the Christian Middle Ages that no other ancient poet would achieve. The voyage of Aeneas is often interpreted allegorically in Christian terms as well. One Christian poet named Proba, writing in the 4th century AD, even used verses extracted almost entirely from the Aeneid to compose a cento, or a patchwork poem, that told stories from the Bible, focusing on the life of Christ. This is only to say that Virgil was the poet and author for many medieval readers and writers. Dante here takes part in this tradition, but he makes it personal in a very powerful way. I'd like to turn now to the beginning of Inferno 2. In the pilgrim, Dante expresses his doubts about his own worthiness. He refers to Aeneas' descent into the underworld, which is described in the 6th book of the Aeneid, and to the ascent into heaven by the Apostle Paul. The descent of Aeneas was poetically feasible because of the importance of the voyage from Troy to found the city that would become Rome, the center of empire, and later the center of the Catholic Church. Dante situates himself here as the successor not only of Virgil, the poet, but also of Aeneas as a foundational character, Phineas's journey to the underworld was poetically feasible because of its link to the foundation of Rome, even though it wasn't true in fact, then the ascent of the Apostle Paul into heaven was real and accounted for by the Bible. Dante's voyage will resemble both, but he can't say this directly. Instead, he uses irony and modesty to express this similarity indirectly. I am not Aeneas, he says, nor am I Paul. Instead, we are to understand that he is in fact like both. He will descend into hell like Aeneas, and he will ascend into heaven like Paul. Later on in Inferno 2, Virgil's role as minister of God's grace is highlighted by his link to the Virgin Mary, St. Lucy, and Dante's beloved Beatrice in heaven. I just want to highlight briefly a part of Beatrice's words to Virgil as she enjoins him to save her friend in danger. In the tercet that begins in line 67, Beatrice is reported as saying, "Set out, and with your polished words, go to his aid." She goes to Virgil because of his mastery over language and his ability to use speech to move Dante to action. She chooses him because he's a poet. This dramatic scene perhaps corresponds with the formative and consolatory role that Virgil's poetry had for Dante in his adult life. For Dante, Virgil is the poet of Rome and of the empire that would become the realm of the Christian world. He is also the pagan poet who was seen to have most closely prefigured Christianity, an intellectual authority on human nature and history. But perhaps most importantly, he's the poet whose work most affected Dante personally and professionally, offering to him a new way to engage with the world through poetry.